On an April morning in 1994, inside a quiet greenhouse above Seattle, a man with a shotgun lay still while the world outside kept spinning. A box of pills sat empty on the floor, and a bent spoon rested nearby, two small objects that told a story far darker than any chord he ever played. He had been called the voice of a generation, yet no one could save him. Was it just the heroin that took him, or something far more sinister hiding behind the silence? The answer is not in the rock star lifestyle, but in a system that failed him long before that final morning. There was a raw, howling intensity in Kurt Cobain that the world chose to hear as anguish, but the true source of that torment was far more physical than anyone imagined. Beneath the flannel shirts and the snarling guitar, he carried a chronic stomach condition that twisted his insides into a knot of relentless, burning agony. This was not a poetic metaphor for the alienation of his generation. It was a visceral, daily assault on his body that no amount of fame or artistic triumph could ever soothe. The pain was a constant grinding companion, a private hell that he could not escape, demon that only grew louder as his public life swelled. In the biography Come As You Are, published in 1993, Michael Azerrad documented how this chronic pain was believed to stem from irritable bowel syndrome, a diagnosis that offered no real remedy. Cobain, desperate for any kind of relief, resorted to a self-made cocktail of prescription medications and eventually heroin to quiet the storm inside him. The so-called rock and roll lifestyle was for him less a rebellion than a necessary anesthetic, a brutal trade-off where the drug's numbing effect was worth the suffocating weight it brought. He wasn't chasing a high, he was desperately trying to reach a baseline of comfort that his own body refused to provide. This was a man at war with his own flesh, a battle he was losing one day at a time. The desperation of his quest for relief is almost unbearable to consider. In a 1992 interview with Guitar World magazine, he confessed that the pain was so catastrophic that he felt like committing suicide by jumping off a pier, a thought that reveals the profound hopelessness he was drowning in. Instead of giving in to that final impulse, he chose a different path, which was to increase his heroin use, because it was more effective at numbing the agony than any prescribed medicine. The drug became his twisted salvation, a way to stay alive even as it was contributing to his undoing, a bargain with the devil made in the desperate currency of a suffering body. That interview offers a chilling glimpse into the sheer, unrelenting despair that defined his private existence. He was aware of the trap he was in, even as he kept falling deeper into it. In a letter written just before his death in 1994, published later in Journals, he wrote that everyone thought he was high, but only he knew that the drugs were actually killing him. This is not the statement of a man chasing a fleeting pleasure. It is the clinical, sorrowful observation of a patient who has lost faith in the very medicine meant to save him. He understood the irony perfectly well, that the thing which brought him relief was the very thing that was severing his grip on life. But when the alternative was a searing, unmanageable pain, he could see no other way forward, and he was cruelly left with only two equally unbearable options. How long can a person be expected to choose between agony and oblivion before the choice is made for them? Seattle, 1994. By the time the police started pulling apart Kurt Cobain's life, they found a pattern that would become a textbook case. A man in constant motion between clinics, presenting the same complaint to a rotating cast of strangers, each one unaware of the last prescription. This wasn't a secret, it was a system. The medical files spread across the city told a story that the coroner's report never could, a story of desperate, systematic acquisition. The Seattle Police Department, after combing through his medical records from 1992 to 1994, uncovered a startling network. Cobain had been prescribed 12 different medications from 9 different doctors across 5 separate clinics in the Seattle area. This wasn't a single doctor managing a complex case. It was a scattergun approach to pain management. Each doctor saw a fragment of the problem, and none of them saw the full picture, creating a phantom patient who existed only on paper. The system, designed to help, was instead a silent partner in his unraveling. Why was this so easy? In the early 90s, the federal framework for tracking prescriptions was practically non-existent. There was no centralized database, no electronic monitoring, no way for a pharmacist in one part of town to know what was being dispensed across the street. The laws that were supposed to protect the most vulnerable were still analog, bound by paper and trust, in a world that was moving much faster. This legislative blind spot wasn't an oversight, it was a wide open door, and for a man in agony, it was the only path that seemed to lead anywhere. How could a system so advanced miss a signal so loud? The cracks in the facade were beginning to show. On April 3, 1994, just 5 days before his body was found, Seattle pharmacist made a decision that could have changed everything. He refused to fill a prescription for Cobain, suspecting it was fraudulent. The detective's report from the Seattle Police Department notes the incident, a brief, human moment of professional integrity. Yet the system's failure was that this refusal was not a dead end. It was a simple inconvenience, a mere redirect on a map of options. Cobain didn't need to convince that one pharmacist. He just needed to find another one who wouldn't ask the question. He did. The machinery of pharmaceutical marketing did not pause for a funeral, nor did it pause for a man's agony. 2 years after Kurt Cobain's body was found, a company called Pharma unleashed a product that would replicate his private hell on a national scale. Their drug OxyContin arrived in 1996 with a sales pitch so seductive it bypassed the language of medicine entirely. The central claim was almost too perfect to question, and that was precisely the problem. Purdue told doctors that OxyContin carried a rate of addiction below 1%, a figure plucked from a short-term study that their own data could not support. Connecticut's Attorney General, Richard Blumenthal, would later describe their approach as selling through deception rather than competing on price. The Food and Drug Administration finally sent a warning letter in 2001, but by then the sales force had already fanned out across the country. How does a company train an entire army of representatives to look physicians in the eye and repeat what they know to be false? Court filings from 2020 allege that Purdue's executives did exactly that, instructing their sales teams to assure doctors that OxyContin was less habit-forming than other painkillers. The men at the top knew the science said otherwise, and they handed the lie to their employees like a script. Consider what that meant for the person on the other side of the desk, the one sent out to deliver those lines. A former Purdue sales representative, speaking anonymously to 60 Minutes in 2021, recounted how he was drilled to misrepresent the drug's addictive potential with the same ease as reciting a product label. He was rewarded handsomely for his performance, collecting up to $50,000 a year in bonuses just for hitting prescription quotas. When your income depends on the number of pens a doctor signs, the line between persuasion and corruption dissolves entirely. He quit in 2002 because his conscience finally outweighed his commission. But how many other reps stayed on, telling the same comfortable fiction, while patients across America swallowed the promise along with their pills? The system did not malfunction. It operated exactly as built, with a sales force incentivized to multiply the number of people who would wake up each morning reaching for a bottle. But pause here, because the story demands a moment of uncomfortable clarity. If a sales rep is paid $50,000 a year to nudge a physician's hand, what does that make the physician? A dupe, a collaborator, or just another cog in a machine that measures success in repeat prescriptions? Let us sit with that quiet question, because the answer leads us straight back to the scene of a death. The empty pill vial on the floor of the greenhouse told a story the headlines would ignore. A spoon, faintly scorched, rested beside it with residue that would test positive for both heroin and diazepam, the tranquilizer better known as Valium. On April 8, 1994, the Seattle Police Department catalogued these items as evidence. Their official file number 94322221 eventually released to the public decades later. The presence of Valium at the scene was not an accident, but a clue to something far more complicated than a simple overdose. Here is where the comfortable myth begins to crack, especially for anyone who has never touched an opioid. The King County Medical Examiner determined that Kurt Cobain's blood contained 1.52 milligrams per liter of morphine, the active breakdown product of heroin. To an inexperienced user, that concentration would likely prove lethal, a fact that seems to settle the matter with cold certainty. Yet for a chronic addict with a well-established tolerance, that same number falls squarely into what toxicologists describe as a low range. This single measurement destroys the simple narrative of a man who took one final fatal hit. The body does not behave like a static machine when it comes to drugs. It adapts, reshaping its own chemistry to accommodate the substances it receives daily. Cobain's system had been flooded with opioids for so long that his brain had fundamentally rewired its own pain receptors and respiratory controls. The dose that would stop a novice's heart was, for him, barely enough to keep withdrawal at bay. So if the heroin alone was not the executioner, what was? The answer hides in the combination, a toxic synergy that transforms two survivable drugs into a lethal cocktail. The same autopsy that found the morphine also confirmed the presence of diazepam in Cobain's system, a benzodiazepine commonly prescribed to manage the anxiety and seizures that come with heroin withdrawal. Here is the chilling part. A 2016 study published in The Lancet found that mixing a benzodiazepine with an opioid increases the risk of a fatal overdose by 99%, effectively doubling the danger of death. Individually, each drug is manageable for a tolerant user. Together, they become instruments of respiratory failure. Diazepam suppresses the central nervous system in a way that deepens the already dangerous respiratory depression caused by morphine. The brain's signal to breathe becomes a whisper, then a silence, while the user slips into a sleep from which there is no waking. This is not the dramatic needle-in-the-arm death that rock and roll mythology prefers. It is a quiet pharmacological ambush set by the very substances meant to ease suffering. The scene is now recontextualized. The empty vial, the spoon, the tranquilizer, all pointing to a pattern of self-medication that spiraled into a fatal arithmetic. Before we accept the easy story, we must ask whether the killer was the street drug or the prescription bottle that made it infinitely more deadly. On the 31st of March 1994, Kurt Cobain walked out of the Exodus Recovery Center in Marina del Rey, California, a facility meant to contain him, and simply climbed the fence. He had been there for less than 48 hours, a stay so brief it barely registered as an attempt at treatment before the urge to escape won out. The investigative documentary Kurt Cobain, The Last 48 Hours, confirms that this wasn't a dramatic planned breakout, but a quiet, desperate climb over a wall that was never designed to hold someone like him. The irony was that this place, supposedly the solution, had given him the very drugs that fueled his spiral, a medication cocktail that made little sense for a man fighting addiction. The clinic had placed him on buprenorphine, a drug meant to manage withdrawal, but they also handed him sedatives, a combination that any competent physician should have known was a volatile mix. His wife, Courtney Love, had already told the New York Times in that very year that he had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder on top of everything else, and was consuming a blend of antidepressants that were never meant to be taken together. So the system that was supposed to save him was in practice administering a chemical soup that increased his risk of a fatal overdose rather than reducing it. This wasn't negligence born of ignorance. It was a structure so broken that it treated the symptoms of his distress with the very substances that caused it. How can a rehabilitation centre, a place whose entire purpose is to wean a person off dangerous drugs, end up prescribing a fresh supply of them? The answer lies in the fact that these facilities were not isolated sanctuaries of care, but cogs in a machine that had already learned to see patients as a revenue stream for pharmaceutical companies. The sedatives and the buprenorphine were not a personalised plan for Cobain's recovery. They were a standard protocol that existed to placate him, to keep him quiet and manageable. The staff likely knew he was slipping away, but the protocol was the protocol, and no one was willing to step outside of it to look at the broken man in front of them. He fled because he must have understood, with a clarity born of desperation, that the place was not a refuge but a trap, one that offered him anxiety pills to calm his nerves and a substitute opioid to soothe his cravings, all while pretending to cure him. The tragedy of the Exodus Center wasn't just that he left, but that the treatment itself was a failure, and his escape was the only logical conclusion to a stay that was never really about healing. And that single failed attempt at institutional salvations speaks to a deeper, more terrifying truth about a healthcare system that had lost sight of the patient. On the 8th of April 1994, the world found Kurt Cobain in a room above his garage in Seattle. A shotgun rested across his chest, and nearby sat an empty pill bottle and a spoon. He was the voice of a generation, the reluctant prophet of grunge, and his death was ruled a suicide. But what if the heroin was only the final chapter of a story that began with a system failure? Years before the gun, Cobain lived with a pain that hollowed him from the inside, a chronic stomach condition that no doctor could seem to fix. In Michael Azrad's 1993 biography, Come As You Are, the singer is depicted as a man tormented by irritable bowel syndrome, desperate enough to try any remedy. He told Guitar World in 1992 that the agony was so severe he wanted to kill himself by jumping off a pier, and the only thing that numbed it was heroin. In his own journals, published posthumously in 2002, he scribbled a dark confession. Everyone thought he was high, but he knew the drugs were killing him. That private war between his body and the medical establishment is the real starting point. He was not a hedonist chasing a rush. He was a patient whose legitimate suffering went untreated and unmanaged. So he self-medicated, and the medical system that failed to heal him became the very machine that supplied his escape. The line between relief and destruction blurred until it vanished entirely. But why did every doctor he visited reach for the prescription pad instead of asking deeper questions? The answer lies in a movement that swept American medicine in the mid-90s, one that redefined how pain was measured and treated. The phrase "pain is the fifth vital sign" was championed by the American Pain Society in 1995, alongside the Veterans Health Administration, and it cast pain alongside pulse, blood pressure, temperature, and respiration. On its surface it seemed compassionate. No one should suffer in silence. But behind the slogan was a calculation. If pain was a vital sign, then a patient's reported score was a number that demanded treatment, and the doctors who denied patients lower scores risked being seen as cruel. The pharmaceutical industry, years before Cobain's death but laying the groundwork for it, saw the opportunity. Court documents from the 2019 Oklahoma trial against Johnson & Johnson revealed that drug makers marketed opioids directly to family physicians in rural states, including Washington, with that very slogan. They convinced doctors that an unrelenting number on a scale of 1 to 10 was a medical emergency, and that the only humane response was a prescription for a powerful narcotic. The Institute of Medicine reported in 2011 that an estimated 100 million American adults suffer from chronic pain, a massive population that pressured doctors into writing prescriptions quickly rather than investigating root causes. By 2001, the Washington State Department of Health found that opioid prescriptions in Cobain's home state had jumped 90% in just 6 years, while the population grew only 12%. Consider Huntington, West Virginia. A city of 49,000 people received 20 million prescribed opioid pills over 6 years, roughly 408 per person, and the addiction rate quadrupled compared to the national average. Cobain died in 1994, but the policies of that decade created the disaster that followed. The doctors weren't evil. They were following a system that turned patient satisfaction scores into a license to prescribe. They were praised for reducing pain, and no one audited the long-term consequences. But here's the uncomfortable truth. When a doctor treats pain as just a number, the person behind the number gets lost. Cobain walked into clinics with a broken digestive system and came out with a death sentence signed by well-meaning hands. The system was built to soothe the symptom, not the man, and every prescription he filled tied another knot in the rope that would hang him. Ask yourself, if the fifth vital sign had been listened to instead of medicated away, would that empty pill bottle have ever been there at all? Cobain told Rolling Stone in 1993 that he used heroin purely as a painkiller for his stomach, not for the high, a statement that shatters the comfortable myth that addicts are simply chasing pleasure. The reality is far more uncomfortable. According to a 2019 survey by the Washington Post and the Kaiser Family Foundation, 4 out of 5 Americans currently addicted to heroin began with prescription opioid painkillers first. That means the gateway was not a shadowy dealer on a street corner, but a legitimate prescription pad from a trusted physician. And the law itself has helped cement this path since 1970, when the Controlled Substances Act placed heroin in Schedule 1, completely banned for medical use, while placing synthetic opioids like OxyContin in Schedule 2, a distinction that made the legal drug far easier to obtain than its illegal cousin. The story of Eric Clapton proves that this dangerous prescribing habit was not a product of the 1990s, but a deeply ingrained medical tradition. In his 2007 autobiography, Clapton recounts how a doctor recommended heroin to him in the 1970s as a cure for his alcoholism, a treatment that left him severely addicted for 3 years before he finally entered rehab in 1982. Here was a world-famous guitarist handed a highly addictive narcotic by a medical professional who should have known better, all because the system trusted prescription drugs over the messy reality of addiction. So when Cobain walked into a clinic in Seattle complaining of agonizing stomach pain, he was not asking for a party rug, he was asking for relief. The assumption that Cobain was simply a junkie seeking a thrill is contradicted by his own words and behavior, which reveal a man desperately trying to numb a physical torment that no doctor could cure. He did not hide his drug use in the shadows of glamour. He spoke about it openly, in interviews, as a medical necessity rather than a recreational escape. And that honesty is precisely why his case exposes the darker truth. When the medical system fails to treat the root cause of real pain, it pushes patients directly into the arms of illegal substances. The real story of Kurt Cobain was never about a rock star who lost control, but about a patient who has failed at every single turn. And here is the final bitter irony. The very same system that condemned him for using heroin had already lit the path to it with legal FDA-approved pills. So what does it say about a society that writes a prescription for addiction with one hand and then punishes the addict with the other? On the morning of April 8, 1994, an electrician entered a Seattle greenhouse and found a body. A shotgun rested across the chest and a note lay nearby. The man had been dead for days, his fame still ringing through the walls of the music world. He had been hailed as the voice of a generation, a tortured poet of grunge. But the empty pill bottle and the spoon beside him whispered a more complicated truth. What if the addiction that killed him was not the cause, but the symptom of a deeper failure? The Seattle Police Department's case file, released through a Freedom of Information request in 2021, documented a crucial physical clue from April 8, 1994. An empty prescription vial and a teaspoon stained with heroin and diazepam, a common brand of Valium. The King County Medical Examiner's toxicology report then sharpened the mystery, finding a blood morphine concentration of 1.52 milligrams per litre. That level is lethal for a novice user, of course, but medical examiners described it as low for a chronic addict with a developed tolerance. The body of Kurt Cobain was already accustomed to staggering amounts of opioids. The report also confirmed traces of diazepam in his system, a benzodiazepine typically prescribed to manage anxiety and the seizures that come with heroin withdrawal. The pharmacological reality of his final days, so often reduced to a single word like heroin, was instead a study in how prescription medicine and street drugs had converged around a man in agony. That convergence was no accident, it was engineered, and to understand it you have to look at how a corporation turned a legal molecule into a nationwide catastrophe. In 1996, 2 years after Cobain died, the Food and Drug Administration rushed to fully approve OxyContin, a new painkiller built on oxycodone, which has a mechanism of action strikingly similar to morphine in the brain. Yet the agency did not require long-term safety trials to verify the drug's addictive liability, a regulatory lapse that would echo for decades. Purdue Pharma, the manufacturer, then flooded the market with a marketing blitz, and by 2007, according to the US Department of Justice, the company and its top executives paid $634.5 million in penalties for misleading the public about OxyContin's risks. 3 executives pleaded guilty to a criminal misdemeanor charge of misbranding, a slap on the wrist for a campaign that had unleashed a wave of addiction. Consider that a former Purdue sales representative, in an interview with CBS's 60 Minutes in 2021, admitted he was trained to lie about the drug's addictiveness, and he earned $50,000 a year in bonuses for hitting prescription quotas. He quit in 2002 out of guilt. Many of his colleagues stayed, and they were all following a playbook designed in a corporate boardroom, not a patient's best interest. That playbook was disturbingly precise, and it even had a name for people like Cobain. In a legal filing in 2019, the New York State Attorney General's office revealed that drug companies, including Purdue Pharma, maintained internal databases that flagged certain doctors as easy prescribers, physicians who would write scripts with little resistance. Among the names on that database were some of the very Seattle area doctors Kurt Cobain visited during his final months. To exploit these physicians, the companies dispatched extra sales representatives, men and women rewarded for pushing quotas rather than practicing medicine. An internal email, entered into evidence in a 2019 trial in the Eastern District of Kentucky, showed a Purdue sales director describes the strategy as give them a reason to write the prescription. Each sales rep received roughly $1,200 for every new physician they converted to a regular OxyContin prescriber. This was not the work of a few rogue pharmacists. This was a systematic effort to identify, target, and monetize vulnerability, and it operated right under the nose of the FDA for years. One of the most quietly devastating examples of this system is not a rock star at all, but a former First Lady, Betty Ford, who served as First Lady of the United States from 1974 to 1977, spent 14 years secretly addicted to opioids and alcohol, her dependence born from a prescription for Valium to manage neck pain. As she wrote in her autobiography, The Times of My Life, published in 1978, the pills were given to her by the most respectable of doctors, and she had no reason to question them. It was only after her family staged an intervention in 1978 that she entered treatment, and she later founded the Betty Ford Center for Addiction Recovery. Her story proves that this was never about a demographic, a gender, or a social class. The pharmaceutical industry treated everyone, from a punk rocker in Seattle to a well-heeled political wife, as simply another point of sale. What might have been a moment for the system to learn from Cobain's suffering, instead, became a template for further disease. So what do you do when you suspect that someone in your own family is being slowly consumed by the same medical machine? The CDC and the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria provide a clear, practical framework that can be adapted to any home, including a multi-generational household. Step 1. List every painkiller and anti-anxiety medication in the family cabinet and write down a start date on each label. You cannot see a problem you cannot name. Step 2. Observe for 2 weeks. Tracking signs like daytime drowsiness, irritability, a sudden loss of appetite, or a tendency to find constant reasons to leave the house for another refill. Step 3. If you notice use beyond the prescribed dose, ask the 2 standardized cage-ed questions. Have you felt you should cut down on your use? And have you felt annoyed by people criticizing your drinking or drug use? A yes to either is a red flag. Step 4. Call a professional helpline without giving your name, like the dedicated line at the Mai Hongdae Psychiatric Hospital, which operates in the community and can offer guidance anonymously. Step 5. Do not lead with judgment. Avoid language that labels a person, and instead use a simple, honest phrase like, "I have noticed you're taking more medication than before, and I'm concerned for your health." That one sentence, based on the SBIRT technique, can open a door that shame has locked shut. This entire tragedy becomes more poignant when you consider that it did not have to end at 152 milligrams per litre of morphine. The people who signed off on the very incentive structures that destroyed Kurt Cobain were profiting from a different formula, one where the reward was measured in billions. Now that you have seen the empty bottle on his floor, you cannot unsee the hands that filled it. A Stanford University School of Medicine study from 2020, which tracked more than 21,000 chronic pain patients, found that after 12 months, prescription opioids offered no better long-term relief than a placebo, gutting the pharmaceutical industry's cherished claim of medical necessity. So what do we actually do with that knowledge when we are the ones sitting in the examination chair? The first line of defense is a simple pre-planned conversation, one that begins long before a prescription pad ever touches the desk. Before you even step into the clinic, start a small notebook, the kind that fits in a coat pocket, and title it with the dates and times of your pain. On each page, write down a number from 1 to 10 for your pain level, the exact moment it flares, and what you were doing when it arrived. When the doctor asks you to describe the problem, hand over that notebook instead of relying on memory, because it transforms you from a vague complainant into a precise reporter. Then, calmly state your preference before any medication is suggested, saying you would rather try an anti-inflammatory or physical therapy before accepting any synthetic opiate. If the physician still reaches for the opioid prescription, you now know the 3 questions you must ask in return. Ask how many days of use are considered the absolute maximum, what respiratory side effects you should watch for, and whether you can schedule a follow-up before any dose increase. These 3 questions, drawn directly from the Mayo Clinic's pain management guidelines, put a small but crucial pause between the doctor's writing hand and your future dependents. Once you leave the office, photograph the prescription immediately and send it to a sibling or spouse, not as a gesture of distrust, but as a transparent checkpoint that makes it harder to quietly refill on your own. 14 days later, evaluate yourself with the addiction behaviors checklist, asking whether the dose has crept upward while the pain itself stays stubbornly the same. If that is the case, do not refill again, but return for a referral to a pain specialist who treats the source instead of numbing the signal. Beyond the conversation, there is a quieter but equally powerful tool in the form of a personal medical record kept in your own handwriting for anyone who visits more than one hospital. Take an A5 notebook and divide each page into 3 columns, the first for the date of your visit, the second for the hospital name, the doctor's name, and your appointment number, and the third for a brief summary of every drug prescribed that day. Fill in the first column the moment you receive your queue number. before you even enter the consultation room, so the record builds itself without relying on your memory later. When a doctor asks what medications you have taken, read aloud directly from that third column, including anything you bought over the counter without a prescription. At the end of each month, review the pages, and if you notice 3 different hospitals have prescribed the same class of painkiller, stop scheduling further appointments and commit to a single physician for overall management. If you have a health insurance card, ask the facility to print your linked medical history from the national portal before you transfer hospitals, allowing the state system to cross-check your prescription list automatically. This notebook is not about suspicion, but about giving you a map of your own body so that nobody, not even a well-meaning professional, can guide you blindly toward a cliff. You are not a rock star with a record label's worth of money and a private doctor on speed dial. And that is precisely why your defense has to be cheaper and more disciplined than his could ever be. The same system that failed Kurt Cobain because it had no safeguards will fail you only if you refuse to build the safeguards yourself. Everyone talks about the overdose crisis as a wave that crashes over anonymous statistics, but in practice it breaks at the exact point where a patient nods, accepts the pen, and does not ask the second question. Is your silence really worth the risk of becoming just another line in the next decade's report on preventable deaths? Cobain's death in 1994 was not the end of the story. It was a horrifying premonition of a national catastrophe that was already beginning to unfold. By 1999, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention recorded around 3,000 deaths annually from prescription opioid overdoses, a number that would quadruple within a single decade to over 12,000 by 2010. The scale of the ensuing disaster defies comprehension, with a White House economic analysis published in 2019 estimating the total cost of the opioid crisis between 2001 and 2017 at an almost unimaginable $2.5 trillion. The groundwork for this monstrous expansion was laid in the years immediately following Cobain's death, as data from the Drug Enforcement Administration shows prescriptions for oxycodone nearly doubling from 6.4 million to almost 12 million annually between 1997 and 2002. The pharmaceutical industry's machinery did not simply function, it boomed, with sales of prescription opioids growing by a staggering 31% each year during that same period, reaching $8.5 billion by 2002. This wasn't a medical accident. It was a meticulously executed commercial triumph built on the backs of millions of new patients, each one a potential recurring revenue stream. This was the era when a single sales representative for Pharma was recorded coaching a doctor on the dangers of its signature drug, claiming OxyContin was less addictive than a bag of M&Ms, a soundbite that would become a damning symbol of the industry's utter disregard for the truth. Ultimately, the legal system caught up with the architects of this devastation, as a 2007 settlement saw Pharma and its top executives pay a staggering $634.5 million in fines, with 3 executives pleading guilty to criminal charges. The damage, however, was already done, leaving a landscape of addiction that would dwarf the very problem it was supposed to solve. The difference between America and the rest of the developed world became starkly evident, with the 2017 study in JAMA Psychiatry showing that countries with easy access to prescription opioids had rates of intravenous heroin addiction 3 times higher than those in Europe with stricter controls. This comparison reveals a fundamental truth. The overprescription of legal opioids was not a symptom of a global pain problem, but a deliberate policy choice with disastrous consequences. The sheer volume of pills flooding the market created a vast pool of potential addicts, and for a certain percentage, the transition from the medicine cabinet to the street corner was a tragically short and predictable path. The system, driven by profit, had not only failed Kurt Cobain, but had also laid the groundwork for a public health crisis of unprecedented proportions. Each new prescription was a thread in a web that would eventually ensnare entire communities, and each death was becoming another statistic in a growing ledger of corporate malfeasance. What began as a single musician's desperate search for relief had metastasized into a national epidemic that the country still struggles to contain. The empty pill bottle on that Seattle morning was never just a detail of a crime scene. It was the emblem of a larger failure, a system that saw a man in agony and handed him the instruments of his own undoing. Kurt Cobain was not a statistic who chose his fate. but a patient whose cries for help were answered with prescriptions instead of solutions. We remember the voice of a generation, yet we forget the sound of a body that was screaming to be heard above the roar of the amplifiers. Even Eric Clapton, in his autobiography from 2007, recalled a doctor advising him to use heroin to cure his alcoholism back in 1970, proving this deadly substitution was a medical habit long before grunge ever existed. The system that failed him was not a single corrupt individual, but a sprawling network of pharmaceutical interests that treated his pain as a market opportunity rather than a medical puzzle. By 2021, a federal court would finally permit his family to demand more of his medical records from Seattle hospitals, a posthumous quest to understand how the machinery of medicine crushed him. The addiction specialist Christopher Cavacuity from the University of Toronto would later warn in 2018 that benzodiazepines like Valium should never be given to those with an opioid history, as they amplify the respiratory depression that stops a heart forever. This was the lethal cocktail swirling in his veins, a combination that was not an accident but a predictable outcome of careless prescribing. During the very years Cobain was alive and struggling, from 1991 to 1994, sales of benzodiazepines in America surged by a staggering 25% according to IQVIA data, fueled by a system eager to sedate away any discomfort. So we must ask ourselves who truly bears the responsibility for that empty bottle. The man whose body had built a tolerance, or the industry that flooded the market with the very pills that would seal his fate? It is a question that lingers long after the music fades, demanding an answer that no courtroom has yet been able to provide. The story of Kurt Cobain is not an isolated tragedy, but a prophecy of an epidemic that would claim hundreds of thousands more lives in the decades to follow. We can honor his memory not just by playing his records, but by refusing to let his death be a footnote in a corporate ledger. Share this story to tear down the myth of the self-destructive rock star and expose the real villain, an industry that profited from his suffering. And tell us in the comments, after everything you have heard, where do you believe the true blame for his death must finally rest?